we're going to talk about Napoleon's top 10 victories, and there's many battles to choose from. So yeah, we're going to plow through those in just a minute. I just want to make sure everyone can hear me and see me on the chat and all that good stuff. So looks like we have 6 followers, which is good. And yeah, let me check the live chat and make sure you all can hear me. But yeah, so there are many battles to choose from. By some estimates, Napoleon fought in 70 battles, winning 60 of them, while only suffering 10 defeats during this time. So that's pretty impressive over a 15-year career. Oh, there's Jonas. How are you? Okay. Melissa Lesh is there. She can hear me. That's good. Just making sure everyone can join in here as I'm going through. Before we get to the list, a quick reminder to subscribe to our YouTube page below. So hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And you can expect a lot more content coming from our YouTube channel very soon. EBBU Plane Spotting. Hello there. Another reminder is to give us a follow on Apple Podcasts, Podbean, Pocket Casts, iHeartRadio, and anywhere podcasts are heard. I'd also like to give a big shout out to our Patreon supporters. I could not do this podcast without you, and I really appreciate your support. If you're not yet a Patreon member, you can become a free member or a paying member. All you have to do is go to patreon.com/Generals of Napoleon. And also make sure you stick around after the chat. I'm going to answer any Q&A, any kind of questions you guys have in the chat after I go through the top 10. All right, we got more people joining. Look at that. Military history, Jesse Blag 21. This is great. Look at all you guys saying hello to me. Lots of emoji work. I like it. Let's see. So I've got my list here. Shouldn't take too long. I want to go into some detail on each battle, but I don't want to go into every regiment went here and this regiment went there on every battle. It's just more of an overview on which battles I think would be his top 10. Okay, we're 2 minutes in now, so I guess I could jump in. Before I get to the top 10, I wanted to do an honorable mention list. These are impressive battles, but didn't quite make the top 10. So for Napoleon, his victories at Rivoli, Ligny, Arcole, Bautzen, and the 6 Days Campaign during the 1814 invasion of France, I highly recommend learning about the 6 Days Campaign because he won an impressive 4 battles in those 6 days over much larger forces. So if you have something like, if you're really into military history and tactics, I really recommend you checking out the 6 Days Campaign in 1814. Okay, look at this. I'm so excited. Jonas is here. Melissa's here. EBBU, Jesse Blag, and Military History. What a great crew. Thank you, everyone, for following. And without further ado, we'll jump right in. Okay, number 10, we have the Battle of Castiglione. I like this one because of how much Napoleon accomplished in his first 5 months as commander-in-chief. Don't forget, he's a very young guy at this time. He's like 25, 26, and he's taking command of an army, with 40,000 troops. And in the first month after taking command of the French army, he knocks Piedmont out of the war and occupies the great city of Milan. He also wins a string of battles. He besieges the fortress town of Mantua. But his biggest challenge occurs in August 1796, when an Austrian force of 25,000 under General Wurmser attempts to defeat him. Now, by this time, Napoleon has troops kind of spread out throughout Italy. And he has 21,000 troops initially, but he knows that another 10,000 reinforcements are on the way to Castiglione. So he tries a risky tactic here. What he does is a feigned retreat in front of the Austrian army to kind of rope them in, and it works pretty well. This is really hard to do. It's hard to tell your troops to pretend to retreat and not have them go into a panic. And you also have to tell them to stop at a certain point and tell their troops to turn around and advance and start attacking again. So it's a very tricky maneuver, but it works really well. The French generals under Napoleon, Augereau and Massena, did excellent work as divisional commanders in this one. And General Marmont, who's handling the artillery, he also performs well. The Austrians suffer about 3,000 casualties and 20 cannons captured, while Napoleon loses about half that, 1,500 men to the casualty list. There's a great quote that I'd like to read from historian and Napoleon biographer David Chandler, who writes, quote, "The form of battle proves beyond any doubt that Napoleon's master battle plan was already clear in his mind as early as 1796. In subsequent years, he might polish or improve its technique, especially the crucial matter of timing the successive stages. But all the elements of the successful attacks carried out later at Austerlitz, Friedland, and Bautzen were already in existence and in operation at the Battle of Castiglione." End quote. So yeah, I think that was a really good quote, and Chandler really knew Napoleon. So that kind of sums up how that went. Oh, look at this. I got everyone here. Yeah, you got Jonas commenting, Messena, EBBU. Yeah, Messena was one of my favorites. Okay, number 9, although technically not a battle, is the capitulation at Ulm. And it doesn't really have a climactic battle like in Austerlitz, but Napoleon did force almost 30,000 Austrians to surrender by simply outmaneuvering them. And it's just really incredible that Napoleon could demonstrate that you could win a campaign without winning a major battle. So essentially, before this happened, Ulm, Napoleon has all of his troops on the coast of France. They're getting ready for an invasion of England. But for many reasons, Napoleon cannot gain control of the English Channel. So he can't get across that little bit of ocean to get into England. So he basically does a 180 with his troops and sends them all hundreds of miles over to Germany to face the Austrians. Now, talk about logistics, but it's very impressive in the 1800s to send 200,000 troops from the coastline of France, hundreds of miles into Bavaria on a gigantic right wheel attack. Basically, he showed up where Austrian General Mack expected them the least. Marshal Berthier and his planning staff deserve a ton of credit in this one. Marshal Ney crushed a probing attack at the Battle of Elkingen, and Marshal Soult captured 4,600 Austrians during the final stages of Ulm. And as Napoleon accurately proclaimed, quote, "Soldiers, I announced you a great battle, but thanks to the bad combinations of the enemy, I obtained the same success with no risk. In 15 days, we have won a campaign." End quote. So the speed of Napoleon's advance and the slowness of the Austrian response really sealed the outcome before any battles were fought. And that's why I like Ulm in this one. Bubbles Vampire. There we go. You're right. I do like Marshal Ney, but we'll get to that. Thanks for joining, Charles. Number 8. Okay, so we had, we've had Castiglione and Ulm. But number 8 is the Siege of Toulon. And now this one's a little tricky because Napoleon wasn't really the commander-in-chief of this one. But I still think it's a good battle that shows his early abilities, or I guess his abilities at an early stage. It's also one of the few redeeming qualities of the Ridley Scott Napoleon movie with Joaquin Phoenix. I like the Toulon scenes. And like I said, Napoleon wasn't in overall command, but the movie and the actual battle showed Napoleon's resourcefulness in getting cannons, ammunition, troops, everything else needed for a successful siege. And Napoleon knew that instead of a direct attack on the city, which would have resulted in brutal urban warfare, Napoleon correctly ascertained that if the French controlled the hills around the city, they could force the British and Spanish navies to pack up and go home because they could just lob cannonballs onto the British ships from those bluffs. So after a few failed attacks, Napoleon and the French army finally gained control of these high bluffs and start to rain down cannon fire on the British fleet. Before leaving, the British destroy several French naval vessels, but they eventually departed, and the victory of 32,000 Frenchmen over the combined British-Spanish contingent of 23,000 troops was a really big win for the new French Republic and for Napoleon. As General de Gaumier stated later in a letter to the War Ministry, quote, "I have no words to describe Bonaparte's merit. Much technical skill, an equal degree of intelligence, and too much gallantry." End quote. On the gallantry part, Napoleon was actually stabbed in the thigh by a British sergeant during one of the assaults, but clearly he survived. The French suffered 1,700 killed and wounded, and their opponents suffered 4,600 killed, wounded, or captured. So Toulon was a pretty big victory at the time for France and Napoleon. All right, look at this. Look at my little live chat. Going crazy. Look at you guys. I'm so happy to see everyone here. Jonas, Bubbles, Vampire making comments. Great stuff. Thanks, guys, for joining. Melissa Lesh, by the way, everyone wish Melissa a happy birthday, her 45th birthday. And I'm wearing a Penn State shirt because college football season is upon us. But anyways, back to the countdown. Number 7. I chose the Battle of the Pyramids, which is a textbook example of modern arms and tactics against medieval-style armies of the old days. The Mamluks of Egypt, and the final results really tell the story of this battle. Napoleon had a bunch of disciplined squares, 25,000 troops that basically just formed squares of men with artillery inside. And attacking them were all these Egyptian Mamluks on horseback. And what happened was these Mamluks, who were undoubtedly brave, but had little chance of breaking into the squares with the horses, they suffered 10,000 casualties. So basically the French just sat there and shot at them for hours on end. The French only suffered 289 killed or wounded. And the victory cemented Napoleon's control of Egypt for the time being. And before the battle, Napoleon allegedly stated that 40 centuries of history were looking down upon his men. So he always knew how to inspire his men right before a big battle. And this was probably his, in terms of landslide victories, this is his biggest victory. Okay, let's see. Number 6, Dresden. This is one of my favorites. In 1813, the Allies had suffered a few embarrassing setbacks at the Battle of Lutzen and also at the Battle of Bautzen. They had thought that Napoleon was a defeated man after his 1812 invasion of Russia, which was a disaster. Basically, he lost several 100,000 men, and the Allies thought he had no troops left. The Allies, after suffering these defeats, they came up with a new tactic called the Trachenberg Plan. And what it was essentially was the Allies said, you know what, we can't beat Napoleon straight up because his men adore him and they will fight to the end. So the plan was to only fight French armies that were under a command of a marshal or a general and retreat when Napoleon himself was in command, unless they had overwhelming numbers. The plan worked to varying degrees, but Dresden was a poorly executed mess. Although the Russians and Austrians and Prussians together had 215,000 troops against Napoleon, who only had 135,000, Napoleon had two factors which saved the day. His forces were in the relative safety of the fortress town of Dresden, so he had the benefit of interior lines of defense, so he could shuttle troops and reinforcements to wherever the Allies made progress. The second factor was Napoleon also had one of his best defensive commanders on the scene, and a guy named Marshal Saint-Cyr, who was the owl of the French army. He was very smart, very quiet, but he always knew how to fight a good defensive battle. Another thing that occurred was during the battle, Napoleon unleashed his Imperial Guard, which he rarely did. And as the French general Marbeau describes in his memoirs, quote, "The enemy, expecting to deal with Marshal Saint-Cyr's corps only, marched on the town so impetuously that they carried several redoubts. The Russians and Prussians, having occupied the suburb of Pirna, tried to drive in the Freiburg gate, when, by an order from the emperor, the gate suddenly opened and out marched a column of infantry from the Imperial Guard. It was like the appearance of the head of Medusa. The enemy recoiled in terror, their guns captured, and their gunners killed on their carriages." End quote. Love that quote. The French took 10,000 casualties, while the Allies suffered 38,000 killed, wounded, or captured, along with 40 guns. So it was another setback for the Allies. Okay, military history AD. Thanks for showing up. I love the comments, you guys. Keep going. Okay, so those were the first 5. I have another 5 for you. Number 5, Marengo. Some people say this should be higher rated, but this was almost a loss for Napoleon because in 1800, he was going over the Alps. He was dividing his forces in front of a superior army, and only the timely return of a division under General Desai followed by a timely cavalry charge by General Kellerman, saved the day, and potentially Napoleon's reign. At the start of the battle, Napoleon's 22,000 troops were surprised by the bold, aggressive maneuver of Austrian General Malat, however you want to say it, and his 30,000 troops. So Malas had a sizable artillery advantage as well, 100 cannon versus Napoleon's 15 cannon. So after falling back, Napoleon had recalled General Desailly's division, who rode up and assessed the situation, telling Napoleon, quote, "This battle is completely lost. However, there is time to win another," end quote. The Austrian general, Malas, was wounded around this time, so he had to retire and hand over control to his chief of staff, a guy named General Zach, who ploddingly chased Napoleon's army. Zach was later captured along with 8,000 of his men. The Austrians lost 6,000 killed or wounded, and Napoleon suffered 5,600 casualties along the way, so it was clearly a close-run battle. General Desailly was killed during the counterattack, and his loss was greatly mourned by Napoleon. General Kellerman also deserves a good deal of credit. As Austrian General Malas related, quote, "The charge of Kellerman had broken the soldiers, and this sudden and terrible change of fortunes finished by smashing the courage of the troops. The disorder of the cavalry, which had disorganized our infantry, precipitated its retreat," end quote. And French General and future Marshal Murat wrote to Chief of Staff Berthier, quote, "I especially have to tell you about Kellerman. Through a powerful charge, he managed to tilt the balance in our favor," end quote. Quick note on Kellerman. I'm going to be doing an episode of the podcast on him very soon with Charles here. So stick around for that. It should be out in a few months. But yeah, Kellerman's one of my favorite cavalry generals. Okay, moving on. The Battle of Wagram, number 4. This is an 1809 battle in which Napoleon rebounds nicely after suffering his first defeat in a decade at the Battle of Aspern-Essling. Again, like Ulm and Austerlitz, Napoleon had time to prepare for this one. For 6 weeks following his loss at Aspern-Essling, the Austrians did nothing to follow up their victory. Meanwhile, Napoleon called in troops and commanders from all over his empire. Prince Eugene arrived with future Marshal MacDonald from Italy. General Marmont arrived from Dalmatia. And Napoleon and Marshal Massena dressed up like humble sergeants to get close to the Austrian positions to assess the best striking point. Both armies had around the same number of troops, around 170,000, so Napoleon was going up against an equal strength army. But Wagram was a 2-day heavyweight fight with both sides throwing their best haymakers at each other. Eventually, MacDonald assembled a giant assault square that pressed the Austrian center line hard and allowed Napoleon's flanking corps on the sides to push the enemy backwards. The Austrian commander, Archduke Charles, finally relented and ordered a withdrawal. The Austrians fought well, and later when one of his ministers mocked the Austrian military, Napoleon retorted, quote, "It is obvious that you were not at Wagram," end quote. The final tally of casualties really illustrates the emperor's point. The Austrians lost 41,000 troops, and the French lost 37,000, including the legendary General Lasalle. Okay, we're on to our top 3 now. I know you're waiting with bated breath to see what the top 3 are. But again, a shout out, if you haven't yet, check out and subscribe down below to our YouTube page. And make sure you're following us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and anywhere podcasts are heard. Okay, now, number 3 is kind of, I put 2 battles in one, but they're both big victories by Napoleon. Number 3 is the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, fought on the same day. And it was famously stated that Napoleon fought a battle he couldn't lose at Jena, and Marshal Davout fought a battle he couldn't win at Auerstedt. Historian and author Digby Smith said of Napoleon's long-shot victory, quote, "This was truly a remarkable achievement on the part of the French commanders and soldiers, and contrasted vividly with the appalling performance of the Prussian general and officer corps," end quote. So at Jena, Napoleon was kind of dispersing his army. So he had his main attack force at Jena, he had Marshal Lannes, Marshal Ney, Augereau in that area. And on the sides, he kind of had Davout and Bernadotte looking for the rest of the Prussian army. Jena, Napoleon had about 40,000 troops against 55,000 Prussians, while at Auerstedt, Davout only had 26,000 soldiers compared to 64,000 for the Prussians. So at Jena, Napoleon pushed the Prussians steadily backwards, and not even a rash attack by my favorite Marshal Ney could stop the French at Jena. After Ney's corps was extricated by his fellow marshals, Napoleon mopped up the remaining Prussians. But this was more of a rearguard force. The main Prussian force was breaking against the defensive squares of Marshal Davout at Auerstedt. Time and again, the Prussians attacked Davout piecemeal, who, despite being outnumbered 3-1, kept the Prussians on the wrong foot all morning. Finally, to the surprise of the Prussians, and probably his men, Davout ordered his troops forward to finish off the surprising victory. Overall casualty figures for both battles finished at 12,600 for the French and 41,000 for the Prussians. This victory also forever ended the legend of the Prussian army's invincibility. Okay. Oh, Willie Aparcero. Hey, thanks for joining us. Look at us with all these comments here. You guys are great. Okay. Now on to number 2 and number 1. Number 2, Battle of Friedland. Again, as author Digby Smith states, quote, "This was Russian General Bennigsen's most stupid battle of a poor campaign. He completely underestimated the enemy's strength and made the classic beginner's error of accepting battle with a defile, a river, at his immediate back. Napoleon's total victory was assured by the absolutely criminal conduct of the commander of the Russian right wing, Prince Gorchakov, who refused repeated orders to withdraw over the river on the grounds that he would rather fight a vastly superior enemy," end quote. So yeah, Friedland is probably just a very interesting battle. It doesn't get as much publicity as, say, an Austerlitz or Waterloo, but it's a very intriguing battle. So in 1807, Napoleon is basically fighting a very tough winter campaign against the Russians in the 1807 battles of Eylau and Heilsberg. Those are stalemates, draws, or even losses, if you want to look at it in that way, for Napoleon. But he eventually catches up with General Bennigsen and the Russians at the town of Friedland. Marshal Lannes' corps was the advance guard for Napoleon's army, and he cleverly baited the Russians into an attack. Lannes only had 26,000 troops, and the Russians thought they could get a quick victory over Lannes with their 60,000 troops. Lannes kept up a defensive line while the Russians poured more and more troops into the fray. Meanwhile, Napoleon quickly brought up the rest of the French army and counterattacked the Russians with Marshal Ney and Victor's corps. The Russians reeled back and frantically tried to retreat over the river, which there was only 3 bridges, and it soon began to buckle. All 3 bridges either fell into the river or were crowded with men trying to escape. The casualties speak to the carnage that was inflicted. The French only suffered 9,000 casualties, while the Russians suffered 30 to 40,000 losses. After this great battle, the Russian Tsar Alexander was forced to sue for peace with Napoleon. Okay, number 1, here we go. I know you're waiting. Yes, it is the Battle of Austerlitz. This is Napoleon's masterpiece. Using subterfuge and cunning before the battle, tactical brilliance during the battle, and astute diplomacy after the battle, Austerlitz really shows Napoleon at his finest. In 1805, the Battle of the Three Emperors was fought in December at Austerlitz within the Austrian Empire. The combined Russian and Austrian force had about 85,000 troops. Napoleon had about 75,000, but his troops have been campaigning nonstop since the Ulm victory a few months earlier, which we discussed earlier in this episode. Napoleon's communications and supply lines were stretched to dangerously thin levels. Okay, he's very far away from his base. There's a political theory called the lack of strength gradient, which means the farther away you get from your country and your supply lines, the weaker your army becomes. So Napoleon was really putting that theory to the test. And the Russians were duped into thinking that Napoleon's forces were at their breaking point. Before the battle, Napoleon relinquished the Pratzen Heights to the Allies, which is the highest point on this battlefield. And military doctrine states that you should never voluntarily give up the high ground in any battle to your enemy. But what Napoleon was doing was luring the Allies into a trap. Only Russian General Kutuzov sensed something was afoot, but the Austrian generals and the Russian Tsar proceeded with their plan of attacking Napoleon's right flank and then rolling up his whole army. So Napoleon purposely made his right flank weak with a small force of troops so the Allies would target that area. But he also put one of his best commanders, Marshal Davout, in charge of that sector. After the Allies attacked Davout, they sent column after column off the Pratzen Heights towards the right flank. And by 9 a.m., the heights were clear enough for Napoleon to launch Marshal Soult's corps to capture it. After some hard fighting and counterattacks, the French army secured the heights, and those Russians and Austrians who came down off the heights were now caught in the trap. They had Marshal Davout's corps in front of them, and then Marshal Soult's corps and the rest of Napoleon's army behind them. So they're basically just in a cauldron of fire at this point. And the battle turned into a rout, with the Allies suffering 30,000 casualties, while Napoleon only took 10,000. The Austrian emperor sued for peace immediately after the battle. And that's why it was one of Napoleon's really brilliant masterpieces. We'll actually have more on this battle. I have an episode coming up, episode 100, where I think we'll do the Battle of Austerlitz. So there you have it. Thank you for listening to my top 10 list of Napoleon's greatest victories. Please check out our podcast and make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, on to Q&A if there is any. I see great comments over here from the live chat. And I got Jonas on here. I have many interesting bits. Thank you, sir. I have Bubbles the Vampire on here. Melissa Lesh is on here. You guys are the best. Thank you for commenting here. And yeah, it's going good. I think we also just released episode 91 on the podcast today. So please check that out. It's The Sieges of Wellington with Dr. Zach White. And again, you can find that anywhere podcasts are heard. So give that a listen. That just came out today. Okay. Looks like the chats have slowed, or YouTube has slowed posting the chats. But yeah, this is a fun episode. I'm so glad you guys listened and checked it out. Yeah, I'm going to try and do more of these chats. I'm also going to try and do some more YouTube shorts, just, quick little things like maybe describing Napoleon's, battle tactics, like the strategy of central position and all that good stuff. So I have some plans on the way for you guys. I really appreciate you listening and liking this video if you enjoyed it. And yeah, thanks for watching the show, and see you soon.